Chapter 13, Urbanization. Key Issue 1. Remember from last unit when we talk about fastest growing NIRs in the world in sub-Saharan Africa from Unit 2, we talked about how on average there's 5 babies per woman, so their NIR is the highest in the world at 5. And when we look at Zielinski's migration model, we know that in much of the low-developed regions such as sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia, we know that there is interregional migration happening to urban areas because of economic pull factors to emerging industrial secondary jobs. We also learned from previous units that sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 3/4 of that urban growth is due to the natural increase rate being so high. And then we know about a quarter of it, 1/4 of it, is through interregional migration. So urbanization rates in sub-Saharan Africa account for 40% of the world's urban growth rates in the world. Here are your key issues for this chapter. We're going to describe and explain why services cluster in CBDs. First, state 3 definitions of urban settlements. Secondly, describe the origin and growth of cities, urban areas, and CBDs. 3, discuss key characteristics of a central city and central business district. 4, describe the 3 types of services found at a CBD. 5, explain the 3-dimensional nature of a CBD. And 6, compare and contrast USA CBD characteristics with other regions of the world. Before we begin, last chapter we looked at both concerns with urban geography, but at different scales. The previous chapter examined the distribution of urban settlements at a national and global scales. This chapter will look at people and activities and how they're distributed within urban areas. When we define an urban area, we look at the city. The definition of a city is an urban settlement that's legally incorporated to self-govern. And oftentimes that is referred to as a central city. So a central city, when it's legally incorporated to self-govern, oftentimes we call those municipalities, where they're able to control the taxes on various services such as sewage or electricity, as well as you can elect officials on the local level, essentially providing the basic services and amenities for settlements within urban areas. Today, when we look at suburbs, those are mostly unincorporated from the central city. So they're isolated from the municipalities of the central city, so they have their own municipalities, so they have their own sewage, they have their own electricity, they have their own local government with elected officials. When looking at urban areas, we see that urban areas consist of a dense core and then densely settled suburbs. Low density land that links the densely suburbs to that central city or the core. The census defines 2 characteristics of an urban area. One is an urbanized area, which consists of 50,000 inhabitants. Oftentimes when we look at those urban areas, we're talking about areas that are at least 50,000 people. And when we look at the United States, there are 486 urbanized areas. And the other classification or characteristic of an urban area is urban clusters, which is defined by inhabitants that are between 2,500 and 50,000. And when we look at urban clusters in the United States, there are 3,087 urban clusters in the United States. These are stats from 2010. And to look a little bit further, we can see that 30% of our population today lives in central cities, 40% lives in surrounding jurisdictions, and 10% live in urban clusters. And keep in mind, as we learned from our last unit, 79% of U.S. population lives in urban areas. Further defining urban areas, the U.S. Bureau of Census measures the functionality of those urban areas. The first is the Metropolitan Statistic Area, also known as MSA. This measures the Metropolitan Statistic Area measures the functional area of an urban settlement. The MSA was created by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and then they used the U.S. Census Bureau data to reflect the extensive area of economic and cultural influence of these regions. And as we saw from defining the urban areas, we know that in these urban areas, there's going to be at least 50,000 people. Oftentimes, they use counties, which cities are located in. Sometimes they'll use towns instead of counties. But oftentimes when we'll look at counties that the cities are located in. And the largest percentage of people work in the central city. By definition, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget states that if they work, there's anywhere between at least 50% work in the central city. That helps define the metropolitan statistical areas. The next is micropolitan statistical areas. Micropolitan statistical areas are inhabitants of 10,000 to 50,000. They're adjacent counties tied to the city. The United States has 546 micropolitan statistic areas as of 2018. For the most part, found around southern and western communities. Previously considered rural and characteristic, but today about 9% of Americans live in micropolitan statistical areas. Here's a look at the 30 largest MSAs as of 2017 in the U.S. So we can see that they reflect our large cities with New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And again, when we look at MSAs and when they overlap, they form megapolises. And so when we look at this chart, we can begin to see where we might see megapolises in the United States, such as near New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. All right, let's take a look at the map here. Here's a map of St. Louis. When we look at St. Louis, we can see that the city of St. Louis is defined by their central city. So that's where the municipalities would be held of people that live in the central city. Then you have your urban area that extends with the orange around the central city. And the orange would be defined as an urban area, or an urbanized area, so at least 50,000 people. And then we can extend out further to metropolitan statistic areas, and these are cities with counties with at least 50,000 people, and 50% of the inhabitants of those counties migrate to the central city. And so what we see here is with the overlap in metropolitan statistic areas, we have the urban area of the entire urban area of St. Louis. All right, and then we didn't talk about, but we also want to mention down here we have a core-based statistical area. Is in any one of the MSAs or micropolitical statistical areas. And it's just combining. When we look at core based statistical areas, it's combining MSAs and micropolitan statistical areas. And then all right, here's another look at a conurbation. Conurbation is the extending of suburbs or urban sprawl. Here you have the central business district. Here you have a central city again that's incorporated. And then you have the urban development extends. So now you have the unincorporated suburbs that's added to the central city. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right, let's continue on, and we look at the nature of cities, and we looking at the economic base of central cities. It's the relationship between the city and the larger society. Cities are planned with economic and forces, political figures, and political decisions, and individual decisions. When we look at the economic base of cities, a more efficient transportation equals greater number of services. Goods and services traditionally were along waterways, rivers through cities. In the 1900s, where they were once used as ports, now these areas are gentrified, seen as areas where middle to higher middle class reside for higher end consumer service jobs. And then the economic sector is located in the water, again, with pre-industrialization. And when we looked at pre-industrialization, there was an agglomeration of manufacturing services along the rivers, which served as ports. Now, as already mentioned, it's changed in the 20th century. In the post-industrial era, where we see most of our jobs in the tertiary sector, these waterways have been gentrified and transformed to agglomeration of retail services or hospitality consumer services, fancy hotels, fancy restaurants, bars, nightlife. Again, looking at the central city, we already mentioned that the central city is legally incorporated, self-governing. Most cities started to decline in the 1950s, so most urban growth was in central cities up until 1950. And then we see the unincorporated suburbs added in the 1950s, which leads to suburbs or conurbations, the extending urban areas that are unincorporated. Again, we look at St. Louis and we can see the central city, and we can see the areas outside that central city that are the conurbations or unincorporated suburbs. We can look at the evolution of the CBD in urban areas. When we look at the CBD, we see in the 1950s, we see the construction of skyscrapers. And skyscrapers is going to be known as the landmark feature in CBDs because it's unlike that of the suburbs, where the suburbs, it has a very uniformed environment with the similar structured houses and residential areas. And then we get in the 70s with shopping malls, and then the big box stores in the 1990s. And really what we begin to see is now the movement of these stores out to suburbs and not located in the CBD. Land use in the CBD. Land use is very intensive use, meaning that they only use 1% of the land. And in that land you find specialized business and consumer and public services. And the main reason for these services located there is because of accessibility. When we look at public services, oftentimes the public services are going to be government offices, libraries, and museums. They're going to be clustered in historically older buildings. Again, here's an example of looking at public services in a CBD. Also located in central business districts are business services. Business services, again, the main reason is accessibility. People in business services such as advertising, banking, finance, journalism, and law particularly depend on the proximity to professional colleagues. Like lawyers, for instance, choose a location near government offices and courts. And the importance of that is because of face-to-face contact for trust factors. And then also, these offices are often centrally located to facilitate rapid communication of fast breaking news through spatial proximity. And again, it reinforces trust and shared professional values. We talk about consumer services. In the past, retail services were commonly in the CBD because they had a high threshold and high range. And the shopping habits and residential patterns in the 1970s, starting in the 1950s and continuing through the 70s and 80s with intra-regional migration to the suburbs, reduced the need for the retail services in the CBD. We used to see that prior to the 1950s and on through the 60s, 70s with intra-regional migration to suburbs, we oftentimes saw the stores that had high threshold, high range, and that served a lot of people as the 100%. They would find the locations of the 100% corner, which is the most the area on a particular location where it was seen as the most accessible and most available to consumers and highest profit corner of a CBD. When we look at downtown offices, today most the shopping habits have changed. The affluence moved out to suburbs. We still see downtown offices, as well the importance of downtown offices with business services and public services. But most shopping malls and consumer services have left to the suburbs. The remaining stores that would be consumer services in the CBD would be a very specialized store like a jewelry or clothing store that attracts shoppers from all over an urban area. Again, those would be, if they're not extremely specialized, they would not be located in the CBD. But oftentimes what we see now in the CBD for consumer services are retail activity that is highest profited during the lunch or work time hours. And these retailers sell office supplies, computers, clothing, office shoe repair, photocopying, dry cleaning, and so on and so forth. These are for the business workers in the CBD. Here's a look at CBD with the public services and the business services, and then the consumer services. Again, we see the diminishing of the consumer services, and those are mostly just for the business and public service workers during their contractual daytime hours. All right, again, here's Mobile, Alabama, and the CBD contains high concentration of public business and consumer services. The tall buildings demonstrate the value of locating near the center, and all the tall buildings, as I already mentioned, are going to show the intensive land use, which we'll talk about here in a second. In other words, they're competing for space in CBDs. When we talk about competition, as I just mentioned, it's very intensive competition for the land. The land use is commonly found where it's very rare in CBDs, especially areas that now are no longer industrial and then industries left out to one-story buildings in the suburbs. So there's the waterfronts are no longer used because water vessels are unable to maneuver in tight, shallow waters of old CBD harbors or ports. We see these port cities transformed into commercial and recreational activities. We see the intensive use of land with the street. And when we look at the street level, we can see that most of the street level is going to be allocated to business and public services. Underground CBD is we're looking at the underground city essentially. So those are going to be including garages, loading docks, deliveries for offices and shops, telephone, electric, broadband cables, anything that's stored underground and out of sight. And even some large cities we see subway trains in large CBDs like New York. We see also skyscrapers And skyscrapers are the most distinct appearance because, as I mentioned, they're very distinct compared to the uniform landscape of suburban houses and shopping malls and factories. Most the first skyscraper was built in Chicago in the 1880s. The skyscraper, most North American and European cities enacted zoning ordinances in the early 20th century, in part to control the location and height of skyscrapers. But now when we look at skyscrapers around the world, it demonstrates the power of business services and the clustering of specialized services on a global landscape. In some areas of the United States, with these zoning ordinances, such as Washington, D.C., no buildings were allowed to be higher than the U.S. Capitol dome, which is 13 stories. And so then we see an urban area that is very sprawled out and very hard to navigate if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. The bid rent theory states that price demand for real estate changes as the distance from the central city, as the further you move out. So when we look at the central city today, we know that most of that within the CBD is going to be tall skyscrapers, and we know mostly it's going to be business services, clustering of business services. As you move out, you're going to see that the land for commercial is going to be at about 4 miles from the CBD, and then in industry is going to be anywhere between 6 miles from the CBD and 12 miles from the CBD. I'm sorry, 8 miles from the CBD. Industry residents are going to be 12 miles from the CBD, and then recreation 18 miles. So again, the bid rent theory tells us the competition for intensive land use near the CBD. Here's a look at the competing for space in CBDs, looking at Baltimore, and has changed since 1903. Industry was the principal economic sector in Baltimore. We look at the land use, we can see that with the ships in the harbor coming in the older Baltimore, and then now we see the changing of the Baltimore harbor, where now we see more skyscrapers. We see the harbor transforming into recreational, consumer service, hospitality, and retail areas. Here we look at Montreal, and Montreal competing for space. Montreal is one of the cities that has underground walkways during the winter months. So we see the intensive land use of CBDs with the underground geography. Here's another example in Chicago. We look at commercial services are on the lowest floors, offices in the middle, and apartments and commercial activities at the top floors. Again, examples of vertical geography and competing for space, intensive competition. All right, take a moment to apply what you've learned. We look at urban planning. Urban planning is government policies that help revitalize the downtown infrastructure. They promote environment and positive economic development. One of the ways that urban planning takes place is we look at expanding broadband internet near the central business district. Looking at CBDs outside of North America, Europe typically follows patterns that are very different from North America, and you can see listed here how they're very different. So they have high rises, but those are going to be in the suburbs where mostly the poor residents live or the new immigrants. And then most people live in the CBDs, and the CBDs are much more densely packed, and they have the more specialized consumer services with the subdivisions of retail and hospitality. And the rent is extremely high in these low-rise structures in the central business districts where most residents live in Europe. All right, we have time. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned.